we are going to hand off to Jeff St. John to kick off this panel. So thanks again, and let's begin. And sorry, last one is if we could actually get some quiet in the back. It actually is quite loud as you're sitting up here due to the room. So if you guys can help us in the back, that would be great. Thank you. Jeff?
Thanks, Tony. All right, that hopefully worked to get everyone's attention. I don't know what's causing that feedback, but I'm going to try talking like this for a while. All right, thank you. So we're back. Thanks all for coming back after lunch. Our panel this afternoon is entitled Regulatory Evolution to Enable Customer Benefits from a More Distributed System. And this is the part of the conference where we get into the nitty-gritty on the public policy part of this equation, the regulatory evolution that needs to take place to enable all these distributed customer-owned energy assets to share the costs and benefits of serving their roles in this networked energy future we're talking about. Three states that have really taken a lead, I think, on this evolution are California, Hawaii, and New York. And we are lucky enough to have with us three representatives, one from each of those states, to get into some details about what they're doing. To my right, we have Michael Picker, Commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission. To his right, Lorraine Akiba, Commissioner with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. And to her right, we have Rudy Stegemoeller. Did I get that right? Thank you. He's a Special Assistant for Energy Policy with the New York Department of Public Service. And last but not least, Gavin Purchas from the Environmental Defense Foundation Fund, thank you. Environmental Defense Fund's Clean Energy Programs Idea Bank, I suppose available for deposits and withdrawals of ideas, who will help us kind of collect all these different state experiences and give us a nice comparison and kind of context about what's going on in each of these states. I think I'd like to start, if I may, by asking each of you in turn to give us a quick description of what your state's regulatory bodies, agencies, utilities are doing to change the game for incorporating distributed energy assets into your mix. And in particular, if you have any definitions you'd like to provide us at this time for how your state is going about it, or any key differentiations that you think are important to draw between your state and other states in the way you're going about it. Would love to open the floor to you all to talk about that. Commissioner Picker, would you like to begin?
Okay. First, let me just acknowledge that former Commissioner Mark Farron has joined us this afternoon. He came in just a little bit late, so I didn't capture him on his way in. He actually held the position that I fill at the commission. And I think I should acknowledge that everything that we're talking about here is built on an infrastructure that's been underway for a number of years, starting with advanced metering infrastructure, a proceeding and a round of investments in smart grid deployment. And so now we're really further into it. On top of that, a variety of different kinds of independent customer choices that at best we support with financing around renewable rooftop, a slug of fuel cell technology that's used by the telephone companies to power cell towers, to battery storage here and there, to some initial efforts to try to do time of use rates, primarily for electric vehicles, electrification of transportation. So we're sort of building this car while we're driving it. I use that metaphor that we used extensively in our RPS. And I think that if there's anything that I would point to as being a element of this next piece is that because we have a lot of this stuff underway, it's how do we bring it all together, and how do we make a lot of small mistakes rather than big mistakes. And so it's very much of a from the bottom up, and not all through things that that are regulated. I think that both the utilities, customers, and a variety of other people have been taking actions that are in their own interest that aren't really explicit within our requirements or even in some cases our expenditure plans, simply to make the system work. A lot of it's being driven by objective conditions. So for example, the high preponderance of photovoltaic in our resource portfolios has made our energy supply highly variable, both by time of day and by time of year. That results in a variety of challenges to the system operators at every level. You add to that the fact that customers have themselves become much more variable. They're taking steps on their own, things that are behind the meter. They're maturing in the terms of the way that they actually use power, and our industries are changing away from heavy use of electromotive force for mechanical operations to more electronics, and where the issue that drives them isn't so much baseload as it's cooling, which means that demand becomes highly variable as well. So how do we begin to accommodate these very objective conditions as well as all these new technologies? So I think that those are key pieces of our upcoming proceeding. I think that something that I think is in the room but not quite in the room is this question of what happens as our rate structure starts to change and we start moving towards more time of use rates. Very difficult conversation to have, particularly with consumer advocates. But I'll point to the enormous success, once again, of SMUD, where they did a test of 100,000 households, big enough to be significant, small enough to really be a very viable test, about a sixth of their customer base. And they got phenomenal results in a number of different treatments, not much resistance, even for the default and mandatory participants, and a minimum of 13% load shift during critical peak days here in Sacramento. So at some point, the customers themselves become part of this new universe that we have to account for, that we have to figure out how we compensate, that we actually figure out how to relate to. This element of engagement is every bit as important as the other questions that we heard in the engineering panel. So I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an economist. I fit into that space that deals with large groups of people. That's where we're going to beat the rest of you.
Thank you. Well, following on what my esteemed colleague here, Commissioner Figger said, Hawaii, as a sister state to California, has learned many lessons from what California has pioneered. But I would like to say that. Is it on? Oh, sorry.
We're willing to let you pay us to make your mistakes for you.
Okay. Anyway, now that I'm technology proficient here with my mic turned on for everybody that's not here in the audience but listening remotely, I'm Lorraine Akiba. I'm the commissioner with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, and as I was saying earlier, we're learning from jurisdictions that have gone before us, whether that's California as a big sister in many of these issues that we're facing, or Arizona that had to deal with some contentious issues recently as well. But I think what I'd like to say is that Hawaii actually is leading and at the forefront in terms of implementing and putting into real-time solutions on the grid to integrate additional renewable energy resources onto the grid and to meet our challenges for Hawaii's clean energy future. If I were to capsulize it in a very succinct statement, I would say that in Hawaii, we are the testing bed, we are the living laboratory for addressing what I call the 5 Rs, which is increasing renewable energy resources in a reliable grid at reasonable rates for customers. That's the takeaway today if you hear nothing else from what this distinguished panel says. I mean, all of us in our own jurisdictions are addressing those 5 essential things, and I call, well, they're 5 Rs, but they're 4 essential things. So I call them the 5 Rs, and we're all facing similar challenges in doing that. Today's panel, it builds off of what you heard earlier in the morning, which is, Many of the jurisdictions, as ours, are trying to modernize and get a 21st century generation system that's flexible, that allows for increased renewables. We're also trying to facilitate from our side as regulators transforming and making a transmission and distribution system that's able to accommodate not only a traditional central plant model of power generation, but also the innovative distributed energy resources that are part and parcel of our system, and to engage customers so they stay connected to the grid, can support the grid, and be a part of the solutions going forward for the modern grid of the future. I'm glad that we followed Paul DeMartini's panel, because I think a lot of what the engineers had to say, or actually having to figure it out, is valuable. I sit on the EPRI Advisory Council, so it's good to hear on a parallel track that the More Than Smart Grid Working Group and collaboratives and the white paper that they issued is actually, it's cited to the integrated grid study and the value of the integrated grid. And folks across the country are pursuing parallel effects, as indicated by what New York, NYSERDA is doing. In fact, within a few days of each other, it was almost like, we were telepathically communicating to each other. But as you know, Hawaii has issued on April 28th a series of very seminal orders in our jurisdiction. One was in an IRP docket, one was in a reliability standards working group docket, and one was in a demand response docket. There was another docket in which we dealt with some other issues in a particular rate case. But by virtue of these orders, we basically provided both policy and regulatory guidance and directives to our utilities, primarily investor-owned utility in our jurisdiction, to implement new business models to become a world-leading operator of a highly renewable energy resource grid. And what we did by virtue of our orders is, it's kind of funny, I see, is it AB 327, or right? What the legislature here did legislatively, and I can see why it perhaps had to be done legislatively, because unlike Hawaii, you have many different service territories, you have different jurisdictions between different entities, FERC, RTO, ISO jurisdictions, NERC. In Hawaii, we do have the simple, solution of operating small island grids. So everything happens in front of the Hawaii PUC. We are the Electric Reliability Authority for now, and we have no FERC jurisdiction. We have no NERC, applicability per se, although a lot of the standards we have adopted are NERC standards. And we don't have to deal with competing wholesale markets and jurisdictions between the RTO and the ISO, and those kinds of kind of bureaucratic structures sometimes that do, as Susan said, present barriers as opposed to facilitating innovation and solutions. So what we've done is we've basically encouraged the utility to file power supply improvement plans for each of the islands in which it operates, a distributed generation interconnection plan, again for each of those island grids, as well as an integrated demand response portfolio plan. And those are currently in open docket, so I can't speak specifically to the plans themselves. And there are many stakeholders who are here today that were at this conference and on the panel that are also actively participating in those dockets, and and so we welcome their participation. But basically what we did was, by virtue of these orders, we have now before us proposals from the utility to look at this in an integrated fashion, to see how we can best retire old fossil fuel units, bring on new types of generation, look at new ways of financing, perhaps look at new models of having independent power producers provide that, and working with new distributed energy resources like storage, which I feel is a game changer. And I was glad to see Janice Lynn and folks from CISA here. I just came back from their conference in San Jose, where it was just amazing to see kind of the synergy of innovation and things that are being done on the customer side of the meter, and not just customer sided, because we've talked about initiatives like community solar and maybe even community storage. But there's a lot of innovation going out there, and I'd like to say that Hawaii is leading that by actually doing, and we're requiring the utility to take a look at new ways of doing business and providing services to customers. And as part of that, it's also looking at the regulatory compact, because that is changing, and looking at new pricing and rate-making mechanisms as our colleagues at NYSERDA are doing, in terms of performance-based rate-making, in terms of other ways of pricing services, so that we unbundle services perhaps, and like people are familiar with in the telecom area. You realize the value of all those integrated grid services that were just bundled into one price now. And you see the value of the different things that the customer uses from the grid, as well as we will properly value and monetize the value that distributed energy resources, whether that's rooftop PV or distributed wind or energy storage, bring to support the grid. As Ryan from Solar City said, distributed energy resources can also be grid assets to help support the grid. So with that introduction, please take a look at our white paper. I think our white paper was also seminal, and it's kind of bookends to what, again, NYSERDA did. It's similar thinking, I think, in terms of what we're doing, but we're actually implementing, we're not studying. We've told the utilities, and we've given them the strategic roadmap to how we feel they should get to the grid of the future, to transform themselves as the utility of the future, and to be able to take advantage of new revenue opportunities going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Rudy, can you tell us all about the New York Reforming the Energy Vision, which
I can tell you a little bit. I'm afraid to hit this button because. How's that? Okay, it worked. Yeah. First of all, I'm glad to hear that you started your proceeding on April 28th because ours was on April 24th. So that's okay.
You guys went first.
We issued a staff proposal on August 22nd. It's on the website, Public Service Commission website. It's only 82 pages long, so it's perfect for your next airplane trip. There are really three key elements to what we're trying to do. First is the goal of making distributed resources a primary tool in planning, managing, operating the distribution system. I think we share that in common with just about everybody here. The way we're going about it is not quite the same based on a lot of what I've learned today, plus from reading your previous documents. The second component of what we're doing is a strong emphasis on markets and customer choice. Customer participation will be coordinated and integrated probably most of the time via aggregators, but integrated by what we're calling a distributed system platform provider, DSP for short, which most likely will be the utilities. We use the phrase distributed grid, but it might be more accurate to call it a transactional grid. One of the central functions of the DSP is to be a market maker and create the price signals, monetizing the values that are represented by an increase in distributed resources on the grid. In other words, system peak, system efficiency, whether it's load factor or heat rate, reduction in distribution infrastructure needs, line losses, obviously. No one's mentioned that, but it's pretty significant. And carbon, of course. And the third main component is rate-making reform. This is where we have to actually change what we're doing, because it's easy enough for us to tell the utilities what to do. But we need to align the utilities' financial interests with our policy objectives. One of the ways we want to do that is by turning operating resources into a profit center for utilities. We anticipate that a lot of the activity that will be needed to make this happen will be done through operating resources rather than traditional capital investments. And we want the utilities to be able to make money doing that. If they can't, it's going to be like pushing a string. Outcomes-based rate making is probably going to be crucial to that. And whether that takes the form of just new performance incentives layered on top of a conventional rate case, or maybe some deeper changes. We've looked very closely at what the UK has done in their regulatory regime, which they call RIO, although it doesn't have anything to do with RIO. And they've taken what they call a toe-tax approach, where they've obliterated the distinction between capital expenses and operating expenses. So we're looking at all of that, and we're, I would say, probably a long ways from resolution on any of that. And then finally, rate design. Rate design issues are really crucial. Standby rates for DG are a major issue. net metering is something that we don't have anywhere near the penetration that you folks have. And so we have the benefit of watching what you've done, and we're reevaluating. We're trying to find, I would say, a more precise way of rewarding, or a more precise way of recognizing the values that solar and other small DG can represent to the system. And then last, impacts on low and moderate income customers, which is partly a rate design issue. It's partly a program design issue. We want to find ways for those customers to be able to participate in these markets. There are obviously lots of barriers. And even to the extent they don't participate, we want to make sure that the overall rate design and program are structured so that they will enjoy the benefits, the system benefits. As far as process, boy, I could go on for I could go on for a long time, and I won't. Basically, there's a whole lot. You know, we're trying to break it into manageable pieces and take them one at a time. I think what keeps me sane is when I remind myself that we, the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, we are not by ourselves building and designing this new system. We've got something like 300 parties in our case. We've had a lot of collaborative meetings. We're meeting constantly. But basically, this is not happening because a regulator is waving a wand and making it happen by fiat. This is happening because the industry is ready for it, and enough customers are ready for it. And so although it's driven by policy decisions from the commission, it's really the actual program design, the system architecture, the market structure. We want those to be built by the participants.
Thanks, Rudy. And of course, I think it's fair to say that all of your states have as an end goal a grid that is freer of carbon emissions than it was, that is greener, cleaner, and one that allows consumers to reap some of the rewards of investing in that as well as utilities. I bring that up because, Gavin, I know that EDF is involved in each of these three states' policy proceedings, and that is what you guys have your eyes fixed on, so I thought I might ask you to talk about that.
So my name is Gavin Purchas. I'm from the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm going to make 2 points today. One is the need for a change in the regulatory compact, and the second is just to go through what EDF is doing in each of these three states to help these very advanced commissioners and PUC representatives in achieving what they want to achieve. But before I do that, I wanted to say a thank you to Jeff, because the last time I was on one of these panels, I sat next to a man called Gavin Musk, and during a moment of temporary insanity, the chair got confused between my name, Gavin Purchas, and my colleague's name, Gavin Musk, and combined them together so as to introduce me as Gavin Mucus to the audience. And it is one thing to try and get your credibility back when you've just been described as an effluent, essentially. So
If you ever worked for a regulatory agency, you'd be used to it.
right. So in order to make my first point on the need for a new regulatory compact, I'm actually going to do it through a bit of audience participation. So this is post-lunch, so you're all a bit sleepy. I know I am. So I'm going to get you on your feet. And I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. So the first thing I'd like to do is everybody who is over the age of 50, I would like you to stand up.
Including us?
Assuming that you can. So you represent coal-fired power stations. You have been instrumental in electrifying the US, driving our economy, but we have recently realized that you kill people. And that you not only kill people, but you are killing our planet. And so we are looking to try and phase you out and replace you with people between the age of 30, and 50. So could I get anybody who is between the age of 30 and 50 to please stand up?
But Gavin, isn't 50 the new 30?
50 is the new 30, that's right, but not for these purposes. So you guys represent gas. Now you have been put forward by the press as the major savior for the US. There is so much of you that we can displace coal with a source of energy that is 50% less carbon intensive. However, we have realized that you are quite leaky. You leak methane, all of you. And as a result, your impact on the climate is somewhat damaging. So
The over 50 people leak methane too.
that's true. That's true. But not quite as much, is the point. So we realized that while you play an important role, you have to be a transitionary one. And so I would like anybody who is below the age of 30 to please stand up. All right. All right. So there are only a couple of you. Now you represent the new and emerging renewables industry. Now that is about 3% of the total electricity generated in the US. Probably you are 3% of this room, roughly. Probably not, but actually I'm going to make sure that that statistic stands. You are the future. However, this is where I get the rest of you to stand up again. There is a serious problem in getting you guys, getting more of you, essentially, onto the system. So now I would like all of the men in the room to stand up. And this is where I get to the point on the regulatory compact. All of you have been brought into the electricity system based on the regulatory compact of cost plus regulation. We have essentially been incentivizing you to build more stuff, put it into your rate base, get a great return, and therefore make money for your shareholders. Now, what we need is a change in the regulatory compact because we need you guys, the existing infrastructure, to become different. So now if all the men would sit down and all the women would stand up. Now, what we need is we need more women. You, right, you represent a smarter system, a smarter grid, one that is capable of essentially interconnecting vast amounts of more of the 20-year-olds that we saw earlier. Now, in order to get you incentivized to be built and deliver into the system, the regulatory compact needs to change from one that is cost plus to one that is performance based. Now, I worked specifically on the Rio concept, which is just coming into force next year for the distribution system, electricity distribution system in the UK. And there, what we have done is essentially put in place a number of incentives to try and get the utilities to essentially bring more women onto the system. So please sit down. The message that you should take away from this is we need more smart women involved in this, obviously, but we need a different regulatory compact. We need one that is not based on cost plus build out, but one that's based on performance of the grid. Now, what I mean by that is essentially this. The Rio concept put in place a series of incentives. Now, Rio stands for revenue for the utilities equals incentives plus innovation plus outcomes. And what that means is that we monitor the utilities on specific outcomes that they have to deliver, such as reliability. We give them incentives to do things like interconnect new forms of distributed generation. We run customer surveys to make sure that the customer experience of interconnection is good. And if that proves to be the case, then the utility gains an incentive on their revenue requirement that builds out and creates more profit. We have a number of other incentives, a line losses incentive, for example, to reduce line losses in our system. We have incentives to create more stakeholder engagement in the process for community solar, in addition to more penalties. Penalties for utilities that don't recover a blackout within 12 hours. If that is the case, they then have to start paying the customer for every hour that the blackout continues. So that is just to get you livened up and to tell you about the basic premise of where EDF is coming from, is we believe the regulatory compact needs to change. Now, how does that apply to the states in which we're working? So in California, I would metaphorically see California as a series of pilots, small mistakes that we could make, but essentially little steps forward that prove the concept. So we have a storage mandate, for example, which will build out more storage. We have a DR workshop process ongoing, which will help to figure out how to monetize and bring in demand response into the markets in California. We have the distribution planning process coming along, which will be a pretty tight and arguably difficult process for the utilities, seeing as it's July 1st that they have to get their plans together, and it's, I think, November or December that the guidelines come out. So they're going to have to really, really push it. But that is an opportunity, again, to have a look at essentially what incentives we can put in place to bring more DER onto the system. Then we have New York. Now, New York is very different to California. And New York has really gone all out. The straw man proposal that they have put forward is incredibly ambitious, creating the distribution service provider as a means of opening up the market is a very novel approach. They have looked at Rio in terms of creating a number of incentives to try and get the utilities at least ambivalent towards the introduction of distributed energy resource on the system or in favor of it. We have, I think, given testimony in writing, and we are now in the process of giving or have given rebuttal testimony. We will continue to be involved. I think you have 88 parties that are giving you comments, if not more, which is obviously a huge amount. More. So it's obviously a huge amount, but we're definitely very much involved in that and advocating for the need for a change in the regulatory compact. Then we come to Hawaii, and Hawaii is really a fantastically unique case because it has seen such an increase in solar panel introductions. I think you've got now 40,000 units on your system, which is causing, considerable issues in terms of both technical issues and market issues. But it is the one state in which solar is now commercially viable without any subsidy. That's partly because your rates are quite high. And it's only in the commercial market for commercial building that solar has reached essentially what we call grid parity, and so therefore can be deployed without subsidy. But the main issue is how to build out the grid. Now, the PUC, in my mind, has been incredible in essentially rejecting at least two of the proposals from HECO, offering now guidelines to them on how they can put forward distribution DRPPs that will essentially lead to the creation of a system that will allow for the 40,000 units to operate better and for more to be connected. We are very involved with Hawaii. We came to see the commissioners not 2 months ago to talk about Rio and performance-based regulation. We will be returning, I think, in 2 weeks' time for giving formal testimony in your rate case proceedings. But Hawaii represents a huge opportunity because it is, I believe, the test bed that shows, if we get it right, that you can have a lot of distributed energy resources on the system whilst building out a grid that is both reliable, affordable, and with a high penetration rate of renewables. So that represents the end of my, hopefully 5 minutes. I'm not sure if I went over. I'm not timing it, but I'm assuming 5 minutes. But I want to reinforce the two messages. One, we need to move the regulatory compact. We need to move it away from cost-plus regulation to performance-based regulation. And two, we are lucky to have 3 of the states here where that is happening. And so watch these guys carefully as to what occurs in their states and how these performance-based regulatory mechanisms operate, because we will learn a lot about what works and what doesn't and what can be transferred to other states. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Gavin. That was amazing. I guess one question I have, it gets down to kind of brass tacks, is obviously there's going to be some conflict in this transition. Men aren't going to give up their privilege of earning a steady return on every effort they make without a fight, I suppose. Nor should utilities, I think, be put in a position where they can't make enough money to keep providing us all the things that we take for granted and have since they got going in this structure, right? I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about some of the key conflicts that you see emerging between the different parties involved in this new regulatory compact that you described. Or what you see is kind of some key terms that are going to be really challenging to get everyone on the same page on. I don't want to start the conversation asking you guys to talk about how people are maybe upset with each other or not, but are there key conflicts that you see need to be addressed?
Let me address that. And it's kind of a response to what Rudy said. I think even though the PUC is ordered and provided a strategic roadmap for our utilities to follow, I think we want to stress in our jurisdiction, I think, which is an important distinction, and I think one that New York is also following. It is a collaborative process, and it is much like a family that sits at the dinner table and disagrees about everything and has passionate dialogue about what they agree and disagree on. And our role is hopefully that there are no food fights that break out at that dinner table in the course of this, but that there is healthy dialogue, and at the end of the day, a consensus on certain things that can be agreed to, a disagreement on other things that cannot be agreed to, and reasonable people can disagree. And that is where the decision makers and that is where the regulators must then make the tough decisions with input from all the stakeholders. So it is a very collaborative process, and we've done that in Hawaii with our Reliability Standards Working Group, a 2-year process of technical, environmental, ratepayer advocates together dealing with some very technical issues in terms of interconnection standards and reliability standards. And so it was a very collaborative process, and it does take time. But I think that's what we bring, and I know that other colleagues from different jurisdictions, and I always stress, because in Hawaii, we are out there in the Pacific by ourselves. We are an island culture, and in an island culture, you think about rowing together. You're all in the canoe, you must row together, or if you don't row together, you will obviously turn over, and everybody will be not the better for it. So I think there are conflicts in terms of the utility changing its paradigm, and that's very hard for an organization to change its organizational DNA. I think we've seen that, the panel that preceded us before lunch, many of the engineers, you're dealing with real-time issues, but you have specific, status quo issues to deal with too, and a generational transition as well within utilities. So that's one conflict that I see. But the utilities have to be responsible for making that transformation. The younger power systems engineers in the room, whether you're 20 or in the 30-year-old category, you need to lead that change from inside the utility. Third parties outside, whether those are DR aggregators and innovators and folks in communications and technology areas that can help provide tools to the utility to do that, you need to keep doing what you're doing in terms of innovation and coming up with new technology tools. But there is a conflict there. But, conflict is not always bad. I don't think of conflict as a bad thing. I think of it as a good thing. It's what foments change and what moves us forward. If there was no energy from conflict, we'd just be in the status quo and everything would stay stagnant. So I leave it on that positive note. I see conflict as positive.
Yeah, this is actually an easy one for me because I've got about 1,000 pages of comments on my desk that I'm almost finished reading. And I mean, what it is remarkable, the breadth of support for what we're trying to do among all of the typical traditional interest groups that we deal with, as well as the new interest group, which is the incredible industry of DER providers, new small, relatively companies no one ever heard of 5 or 10 years ago. I'll put it that way. I would say the issues that people are squabbling over, there are a lot of them, but the main ones, I would say the role of the utilities is very much an issue. Both the role of the utility as the DSP, the market maker, and then the other one is the ability of utilities to actively engage in these markets, to make investments behind the meter or even on their own property, but to make generation storage type investments. That is, I would say, hugely controversial in our case. Data, a lot of issues around data. Data is, access to customer data is crucial for market participants. Access to utility system data is crucial. You have big privacy concerns on the one side, you've got system security concerns on the other side, so that's a lot to be worked out. Consumer protection is another big issue. We have, again, a whole industry that we have had no regulatory jurisdiction over or anything to do with, which are people that provide energy services to customers, not commodity. Commodity we regulate. So what do we do with that as we start to rely on this large group of people to, in this disaggregated grid? The role of benefit cost analysis is very controversial. There are those arguing we shouldn't do anything. We shouldn't take another step forward without a strict benefit cost quantified analysis of everything of what the whole future is going to look like. I'm exaggerating, but that's the way it reads to me when they complain. It's like, we can't do that yet. The benefit, the sort of benefit cost analysis that a commission needs to have to make a broad future-looking policy decision is very different from the benefit cost analysis that we need when a utility wants to actually invest dollars in something. And then finally, I would say the role of advanced metering and how that ties into dynamic pricing. And dynamic pricing gets very interesting when it becomes locational, not just time of day. So I'll let go now, but there's a lot more. Thanks.
I can't honestly say that I see any big conflicts here that compare to the conflicts over regional access to water in California. There's lots of challenges, lots of tensions, but to some extent, there are pieces of an emerging concept within this area of how we open up the distribution grid that is not mirrored elsewhere. There are tensions, for example, between large-scale renewables and distributed renewables in California. There are tensions between different market segments. So, for example, wind and solar. And those are more conflicts than we actually see here. I think that we will see some emerging conflicts, particularly around rate restructuring, which is very implicit and will for the regulated utilities have a significant impact on financing issues. Do we actually begin to call out the costs of the fixed infrastructure and begin to apply them to each individual customer because they all have a unique interest in that, and then begin to look at energy supply and other kinds of individual choices differently? And what does that mean in terms of equity, since not everybody will have access to those kinds of ability to finance those choices as everybody else? I think that anything that deals with dynamic pricing will be very controversial from the perspective of ratepayer advocates. But probably the biggest conflict I see is really a conflict between kind of stability and innovation here in California. And so far, individually, innovators may lose in these debates, but overall, they tend to move the field along. And so I think that the place where we're going to see that is as new customer choices become available, are there significant stranded costs that remain behind, and how do we deal with them? If, in fact, We cannot construct a scenario that actually gets us to all of our distributed renewables goals, and we have to obtain some gas peakers to actually supply reactive power in weak portions of the grid. But all of a sudden, there's a technology breakthrough that nobody could have foreseen now, 10 years from now, and that wipes the board clean. How do we begin to deal with those questions? It's similar to some of the challenges that people had early on with failing nuclear power plants that weren't fully amortized. And how do you begin to deal with those stranded costs? So these are not necessarily new, but I think they're implicit in this endeavor as well.
Gavin, I think you had something to add.
I do. Each of the individuals for their relative states have basically stated some of the conflicts that they're facing. I mean, one of the big ones for me is the access to data that you recognized, in that it is only in a world where data is freely available to all utilities and third parties that you can see a truly competitive market starting to develop. But what I wanted to focus on is the conflicts that are happening outside of the states that have an impact on the states. So the first relates to FERC Order 745. So for those of you who don't know what that is, that was an order by FERC that would allow demand response to receive the locational marginal price. Now what that meant was that in certain situations where peak demand was high, a DR event, such as turning off something, would potentially give you a 600% increased return on what you would have got previously. Not in every situation, but in some. That policy was overturned by the District of Columbia Court on a 3-panel judge. FERC then asked for the decision to be taken en banc, so get all 9 judges to take a look. It was upheld, so FERC Order 75 currently is not a rule. It is likely they will go to the Supreme Court to see if it can be overturned, but it's unlikely that they will win. Now, what that means is there is no federal policy support for demand response, so it falls back down to the states to develop DR markets. What is more troubling is what came out from the PJM market on the 6th of October, which essentially looks at changes they're going to make to the forward capacity market, which would significantly reduce the amount of money demand response could gain from participating in that market. So what we are seeing essentially is, at a federal level and at a regional level, demand response, which is an incredibly useful tool for managing load to deal with intermittent renewables, the market for it is starting to erode. And so what we need to counterbalance that is for states to come forward with their own DR markets. Now, California has looked at this in part, looking at a bifurcated forward capacity market in which DR could be sold. I think that's quite an innovative solution and one that could be moved forward. I know that Hawaii is looking at this in some detail. And I know that New York has embedded it quite solidly in the REV proceedings. But it extends beyond these 3 states. New Jersey, for one, is going to be affected. Anybody within the PJM market is going to be affected. Anybody selling into the PJM market is going to be affected. So I think we are looking at a fundamental shift that these guys have already recognized, that we need to be looking at creating markets for demand response within states, because the federal support seems to be eroding.
Wow. You know, actually.
I'm going to mention one more conflict, which actually is external, and Gavin's comments kind of flagged this for me. And one external conflict that exists here is that while we are all trying to do what we can from our regulatory perspectives to facilitate, a new utility business model, to try to look at new rate-making structures, whether that's, performance-based rate making, or even if you're in a jurisdiction that still has to deal with decoupling. I mean, we've been fully decoupled in our jurisdiction, so sales of kilowatt hours is not how a utility gets its revenue. I mean, so we're looking at other ways to, to incentivize the utilities to do actions to increase renewables. But it's really the way Wall Street rewards, especially investor-owned utilities. I think that's an area of conflict right now, because as was mentioned earlier, the traditional utility gets rewarded for capital expenditures in hard lines, transmission lines, distribution circuits, equipment, and you're realizing those expenditures and expanding the system to meet, reliability and safety concerns, and makes the shareholders happy. And so I think those financial market players that are not in the room today also need to be part of looking at how they change, because there's a conflict right there for many of the investor-owned utilities that play by those rules or get evaluated by Wall Street for how they plan and how they deploy their capital going forward. So that's another conflict area.
Thanks. It brings up a point maybe that's tied to data, I think. It seems to me that essentially what particularly New York is doing is taking a whole bunch of stuff that used to say, okay, utilities, we'll just pay you a rate of return and you do all this stuff and make a little money on top. You figure out how much everything costs, and somehow splitting it up into separate categories of value to the grid that can somehow be, you can assign a value to it, you can monetize it in a market structure. Is that at all kind of accurate? Because I'm wondering how you get to there.
There's two parts to what you're saying. The monetizing the values is the relationship between the utilities and the customers.
Yeah.
Intermediated probably by ESCOs, aggregators, et cetera. That's for customers to be compensated for the value that they can now provide as participators to the system.
Okay.
The second part of that, or I think the first part we lined up is incentive rate making. That's the relationship between the commission and the utilities. That rather than we want them, right now the only way they can make money is by building things and earning a return on it, or by taking their allowance for operating expenses and cutting it. So we give them, you get $100 million this year. Well, you only spend $90 million. Then you fire a bunch of people. Then you just made $10 million. So we need that operating side to become a profit center. We want them to use their operating resources to meet our objectives, rather than their only incentive being to minimize.
Well, I think we're starting to see the emergence of different markets here, and so they're dictated by some differences in technology. And so there's a whole series of different kinds of energy markets. Those have been the easiest for people to absorb. But as people mentioned earlier, there are some services that you can sell to the grid. And a good example is the idea of aggregating 1,000 rooftop solar customers and actually having them forego some of the energy that they're getting from their rooftop to actually provide system services. And so in one, you have a rooftop panel that is replacing or selling energy to the individual consumer. In the other, that same panel in part is aggregated into a service that is selling to the grid operator. And so, it becomes really complicated. And again, maybe that's why we're approaching this in a series of very specific tests, because they're going to require different kinds of market tariffs, and they're going to have different recipients, yet it's the same resources providing both in different parts. And then you add to that it's going to be different in different parts of the grid. So I think it's going to take us some time to really sort out how this works together effectively. And I think that those are some of the challenges that probably are more significant than simply the conflict. Conflicts have a better narrative sound to them because it's contests of will, but here it's a challenge trying to how we separate out these technologies, how we match them against different compensation, and we still end up as frictionlessly as we possibly can be without the long determinative processes on each resource for each customer, for each utility that we traditionally deploy. And I don't think that we can see all the steps here. I think we can see a pathway to beginning to develop that, but it's going to be a very complicated set of conditions. And again, it will take into account some of those long-lived assets that we'd really like to optimize the value of, as opposed to just simply let them be stranded.
We have a few minutes left, I think, Gavin, if you wanted to add something.
Thanks. I thought it would be important to, as we talk about distributed energy resources, to flesh that out into the different technologies that we're talking about. So essentially we're talking about four. One is distributed generation. One is energy efficiency. One is demand response. And one is energy storage. Now, each one of those technologies has a unique profile, some of which create costs for the grid and some of which don't. Energy efficiency, for example, doesn't create any costs for the grid. It reduces their revenue, but it doesn't create a cost imposed on the grid because it's not utilizing the grid. Distributed generation potentially does create a cost for the grid when it sells back and it utilizes the grid infrastructure. And so therefore there may be a case for it paying for that. Distributed demand response, by and large, does not have an impact on the grid. It is a very useful tool in managing load so that at peak times you can get a reduced load at lower cost. And then energy storage essentially is very expensive, too expensive to be commercially viable. And so we put forward with mandates, as we have done in California. Now, the point being that in each of those cases, what ideally we want is a market that allows for each of those to compete. We are trying to create a market, at least in New York, where distributed generation is able to compete on a free and equal basis through a market with open access to data. And I think that's probably true for the other two locations as well. Energy efficiency is already at the point where there is energy efficiency portfolio standards, there is a market for it, and in states that are decoupled, there is essentially the removal of a disincentive to have it on the system. Demand response is a real problem in my mind because there are very few markets in which demand response can be sold. And as I've just stated, there will be fewer. Energy storage, there is no real market, mainly because it is too expensive. It is done by mandate. That price needs to come down. Arguably, it may come down with the start of the production of the Tesla Gigafactory, which may bring down the cost of lithium-ion batteries to the point where they become cost competitive. But I think it's important to note that in some cases we can create markets that actually make this stuff work, as we are doing in New York, and in some cases we need mandated intervention in order to bring down the costs so that there can be a market in the future.
Thank you all. We've overrun our time, so I need to put a stop to it. And sorry I didn't get questions from the audience in, but you guys can mob these folks afterwards. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.